If you are struggling with a lean condition in the running of your engine, more than likely it's a vacuum leak. So in today's video, we have a 1998 Ford Explorer. We're going to replace the intake manifold gaskets, which is a common issue with this car. So we're going to do the upper intake, lower intake, and valve cover gaskets. Now to give you an idea of what we're working on, this is the upper intake manifold. Lower intake manifold is going to be below that, and you can't see it. But as we work our way down, I'll show you where everything's at. But a job like this, it's always a good idea to take pictures with your cell phone of everything that you've taken off so that you can put everything back to the way it was. Perfect example, these vacuum lines down here on the left side of the engine. Let me show you. So you have this green line here that goes down to your EGR valve and a yellow line. Seems like it may not be that big of a deal. These are both vacuum lines, but the difference is this is a metered vacuum line to open and close your EGR valve. This vacuum line is wide open, so it's going to have full intake manifold vacuum all the time. So if you take these loose, they could go to either spot just fine. So we'll hook the green one where the yellow one was, and the yellow one to where the green one was, and it actually looks correct. It looks like it's supposed to be that way, but now you've got full vacuum down to the top of the diaphragm of the EGR valve. So as soon as you crank up your car, EGR valve is going to go all the way to max, and it's going to run horrible. So it's always important, make sure to take pictures all the way around, even things that you think you might not need to take pictures of. Take pictures of it anyway. That way you know where everything's supposed to go. Let me hook this back before I make a huge mistake. Always disconnect the negative lead to the battery. And we're going to be using this Pro gasket kit. Should have every gasket that we need, but we'll find out in a minute. Remove our air inlet tube, 5/16. You have a vent tube to pull out here, and electrical connector here. You don't want to turn and twist. Make sure everything breaks loose and take it out. Now on the right side of the intake, you have your ignition coil. We're going to disconnect the ignition coil electrical connector and the noise suppressor, which is a booger. Be real careful with these plastic connectors. So you see this one's already broken. Slides on, it's supposed to clip right there, but the clip is broken. So I'm gonna be careful with this one. What you can do is take this tab right here, put a screwdriver flat tip underneath there, and push it out. There you go. On the left side of the intake, you have the idle air control valve. We'll disconnect this electrical connector. Take your thumb, push in on the button, pulls right out. And just below that, the EGR back pressure transducer, and you take off its electrical connector. Disconnect, do it the same way. Push in on this little tab and just pull it out. And from there, we come on down to the EVR solenoid. Have electrical connector here. Push down with your thumb, unplug it, and then your two vacuum lines. They just pull loose. Be very careful. They're coming out, but I want to be very careful. It's really not that difficult to come out, but I don't want to just yank and break something. There's one. And two. Kind of move these out of the way. Once you have these connectors loose, these vacuum lines loose from your EVR valve, another vacuum line up here. And just up from there, we have our brake booster vacuum line. Disconnect throttle position sensor. And disconnect these two hoses from the EGR back pressure transducer. I like to mark a lot of things. Take pictures and mark just so they go back the way they came. Put a 1 on that one and a 2 on this one. Even if these marks come off, I know that from the front of the engine I do a number 1 In the rear of the engine I do number 2. Hopefully those will stay. If not, we'll figure it out later. Those just slide right off. Now, this is definitely an important part to make sure you take a picture of and mark it, however you want to do it. This is kind of tricky, the way this ignition coil is set up. This came out of the connector. That was for the electrical connector we took out earlier with the ignition. But on the number 2 side of the engine, on the right side of the engine, you have cylinders 1, 2, and 3. Real easy on this side. Cylinder 1's all the way up here at the front on the passenger side. So this spark plug wire coming all the way around goes all the way down number 1 cylinder. This one goes to number 2. This one goes to number 3. Nice and simple. Where it gets a little crazy is the other side. On the driver's side of the engine, number 4 cylinder is all the way at the front, then 5, and then 6. Well, it would make sense for this ignition coil to be number 4, 5, and 6, but it's not. On mine, this one's number 4. So this one goes all the way up to the driver's side front. This is number 6, which goes to the back. This one's number 5, which goes to the middle. Now the reason why I'm telling you this is because you're probably going to have to take all this loose to get all the way down to the lower intake manifold, because we got to take the valve covers off. We're going to replace those gaskets. All that's got to come off. You may be able to take these bolts loose and just pick this ignition coil up. And this is a universal kit. That's why the wires seem to be so long. You may be able to pick this up, pull it all the way out of the way without worrying about messing with the wires where they go. But it's a good idea to mark it anyway. Now if your engine's running fine, you know they're in the right spot because you don't have a misfire, then it doesn't really matter which way it's numbered. You number it the way you know is right. So if you want to number it as far as firing order and all that, that's up to you. If not, just number them any way that you know is going to be right, so that you can put the wires back where they're supposed to be. So number 1, put a number 1 on this wire, number 1 there. 2, you can call this 6, you can call that 10, you can call this 12, whatever you want to call it. But if you call this 12, then write 12 down here on your ignition coil and you know where it goes. What I like to do is I like to number them exactly the way they're supposed to be on the engine. So this side's easy, 1, 2, 3. And then 4, 6, 5 for the way this one's wired. Then once you have the wires numbered, take a picture. You know you'll go right back to the way it was. So next you can take the bolts loose and just see what you got. 5/16 bolts. Now with the 4 bolts out, you just pull the ignition coil out. What also comes out is the ignition noise suppressor, which I guess I could have left that plugged in. This is coming out from there anyway, so I'll plug this back in. See how much slack we've got. Looks like we've got plenty for this side. We're going to disconnect number 5, number 6. See what we can do with this. We'll go ahead and disconnect number 4 also. And just leave that to the side. As you can see, 4, 5, and 6 run through the upper intake manifold, obviously over the lower. So we'll go ahead and pull those through the other side. On second thought, we'll leave them right there for now. We got to take the intake manifold out anyways. There's no use in trying to pull those things through a narrow passage if we don't have to. So what we've got to do now is take this exhaust, this EGR tube, just connect to the upper intake manifold. This EGR tube goes from your EGR valve. This EGR tube goes all the way down to your exhaust manifold, all the way at the bottom. I was going to try to get that from the top, but if you take your tire off, jack up the vehicle, take the driver's side front tire off, you can get to it right there. So what we're going to try to do is remove this nut, take this pipe off, I mean, it's already in pretty bad shape. I sprayed some penetrating oil in there. This would be the best way. Up underneath isn't very good. Up top is even worse. So try to get a wrench in here, get something to get that off. So I spent way too much time trying to figure out how to get this stupid thing off, wrangling it. What I found, 1 1/16 crow's foot on the breaker bar, turn this way, inside the driver's side front wheel well. You can tell there's been lots of problems in the past with that thing. Put it on like that. There's a lower splash guard that's missing on this, but so you guys take that lower splash guard out. It was all rotted, so I never put a new one back on. Put it on there, and you're able to turn it down and get it off. Now we've got the bottom disconnected. Now it's time to disconnect the top. This is the same tube. Now the top connected to the EGR valve, and I might be creating more problems for myself than what I need to. We'll figure it out when I get it all off, which you actually need to take off. I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect that tube right there. Same size, 1 1/16. Should be a lot easier to get to. Breaker bar. Easier said than done. So what I ended up doing for this one, 1 1/16 crow's foot, 4-inch extension, and a 1/2-inch breaker bar. Weave it down underneath this line. Put it on the nut like so. I already broke it loose, so it wasn't quite this easy, but if you get it on there straight, you turn it, you got plenty of room to loosen it. And just loosen it off just like that. And if you're living right, maybe a little lucky, should be able to screw that nut right out. Oh, look at that. Came out easier. I got it wedged down in there now. Yeah, now this gives you an idea of what this piece of junk looks like. If you remember, these two tubes are what I had hooked up here. Had number 1 in the front, number 2 in the rear. That's those two right there. This hooks into the bottom of the EGR valve. And this portion here is what goes down to the bottom of the exhaust manifold. All emissions. And next we're going to take off the EGR valve. Got 2 mount bolts. One here you can see, the other one you cannot see. 10mm bolts with extensions. I actually decided to use my deep well 3/8 drive 10mm since I can't find a shorter extension. Probably better off for you anyway because your bolts may be stuck. And there's your EGR valve. Nice. And after removing the EGR, gosh, dropping everything. After you're removing the EGR valve, which is right here, I like to put the bolts back in place. That way the gasket stays in place and I won't lose those bolts. Next, we're going to take this nut for the oil dipstick. I'm going to take that whole dipstick tube and everything out. I'm going to use a 13mm socket extension and a 3/8 drive ratchet. Take the nut off and pull out the dipstick in tube. And just like everything else, took some wrangling, a little jiggling, moving the camera around and out of the way so I could get to it. So once you removed your oil dipstick tube, that's the stud right there that the oil dipstick tube nut was on. So now we're going to take the nut underneath that off, so we'll be able to remove this EGR tube from the intake manifold. It's 13mm just like the last nut was. And the stud actually came out of the engine. Now we should be able to remove the EGR tube. Actually, I gotta clarify. This looks like a nut from up top, but it's actually a stud bolt. So what you have is the head of the bolt. This is all a bolt right here that screws into the manifold at the top of the engine. And then the top of the bolt head has a stud on it. That's where the 13mm nut was. So you take that out, then you should be able to pull the EGR tube out of the intake manifold, and like everything else, it's going to fight and be difficult. But I'm actually going to leave it. You have to fight with it coming out of the back of the AC compressor with this line here, but I think we should be able to get it out without an issue since we're taking the whole intake manifold off anyway. Now we got to disconnect our accelerator cable from the throttle body, and also this mount that's on the intake manifold which holds the cable. Let's try a flat tip screwdriver underneath here. Here we go. Pop that loose from the ball. We gotta loosen that nut. That's a 7/16 nut. Once you have it loose enough, that just pulls out. And then this has two little tabs you push in. Look at that. Pliers, that's all you need. Bent pliers. Old, nasty looking bent pliers. Then pull this little hold down off there. Push these cables back and out of the way. So now we should be able to get to our upper intake manifold mounts. Got one there, one here, one back there hiding in the shadow, another here, another one in the shadow, and one back here. And those are also 13 millimeter. Okay, now with those 6 mount nuts disconnected, you can kind of get a better picture of the upper and lower intake manifold, at least the upper right now. This is where your air comes in. You got your air tube that come across here from the air cleaner. The mass airflow sensor goes into the throttle body. All that air comes into the intake manifold, and then these 3 down tubes, whatever you want to call them, they go down into the upper intake manifold. So with these studs, with the nuts taken off of these studs, should be able to lift this plastic intake manifold out. And we'll get to see what I forgot, because there will be something. Yep, something on the back. Yep, another vacuum line. You probably saw it right away. This little small tube. It's electrical connection. How did I miss that? I guess I didn't think. Well, this tube here just goes to the PCV valve. Ford likes to change up where they put all this kind of stuff, but it'll be obvious right there in the back. Now this electrical line, should be able to press this tab down, pull this out. There we go. That's a lot better. Gonna be something in the back still. So now we got a wire connector all the way in the back here. I know you probably can't see it, but you'll see it when you get to take your manifold out. Trying to do the right thing, not break stuff. This is my car, so if I break it, it's on me. There we go. These little plastic tools do pretty good for plastic connectors like these on the hood that you see. Plastic panels inside the car and the back of that wiring harness. Now, what else is held up? Alright, now our EGR tube is holding us up here. So at this point you can just start pulling and yanking and seeing what else needs to be disconnected. So you can see here this line, this goes down to the evap canister for the gasoline fumes. It just pulls off, push it to the side. And then you got the 3 spark plug wires that come from down here off to this side for your cylinders 4, 5, and 6. And then our EGR tube that we didn't get completely disconnected. It's going to be a little bit of a problem up top. I'm just going to pull. Pretty obvious, I've never done this before, but try to tuck these vacuum lines off to the side. Let's kind of pick up and see what we got going on. Pull these spark plug wires through. So I'm just going to have to do that anyway. I was hoping this thing would just pick up and leave those wires laying right there, but that's not happening. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the spark plug wires all the way through the manifold. Because if you remember, they came up through here. So I'm just pulling them out of the bottom. This one's stuck on the mount. So pull it out of the bottom like that. Gives us a little more room. And this EGR tube is getting stuck. I'm going to try to leave it there and pull the intake manifold off of it just like that. And there we go. Whew. Now you can see more clearly what we've got going on. With all this missing, that was your entire intake manifold. This is your lower intake manifold. So one of the issues that these have is over time, these gaskets, they get hard and brittle and they break and crack, and you'll have small vacuum leaks in between the upper intake manifold and this lower intake manifold. Sucks air in. The computer doesn't know how much air is actually going into the engine. All it knows is what the mass airflow sensor tells it is going in, which is all the way, remember that tube come all the way back over here? So your mass airflow sensor is here. So you have all this air that's actually metered. This tells the computer how much air is coming in, but if you have a vacuum leak in this tube, the throttle body, upper intake manifold, then it's going to be a lean condition. And now let's take a look at the upper intake manifold. It's your idle air control valve. This is your solenoid for your EGR system. This is where your EGR pipe was at. As you can see how nasty and dirty this is. You're going to want to clean that out since you got it all out. That'll help it run better. But another big issue is these plastic manifolds tend to crack. So the best thing to do while you have it out is to completely clean all this off and look for any cracks anywhere. Good news is, if you don't have the money for a new intake manifold, these plastic ones, you can actually put some black RTV on them, let it set up, temporary fix or a full-time fix, depending on how you are. And I like to do just RTV fixes on stuff like this. But if you look, each one of these gaskets, they're in place. I don't see where any of them are messed up, pushed to the side, but every one of them's flat. They feel pretty hard. So this is definitely going to be one of the sources of our vacuum leak. These are probably the original gaskets. You figure 25 years is a long time to get out of a set of gaskets, but just the way they feel, and being as they're completely flat across here, they're not sealing anymore. So that's a good sign. See if I can get one out real quick. Golly. I mean, these gaskets are just as hard as the plastic manifolds, so I can't even get them out. I'm gonna have to work to get them out and try not to break this manifold. There you go, that one's digging out. And it's cracking as it's coming out, so that's not good. And you want to make sure anything that you do that cracks, anything that cracks and does fall inside of here into the intake, you definitely want to fish it out. So I finished digging this out off camera. You kind of see, not flexible, you can hear it popping. And here's a new one. Nice, rubbery, flexible. That's how it should be. So that's what I meant when I said good news, that these look bad, because they obviously have not been replaced. That is going to be one source of a vacuum leak. And at this point, we're going to want to partially drain the radiator. Some of the coolant, not all the way down, because this upper coolant hose is going to have coolant in it, obviously, so we have to take this loose to get this lower intake manifold off. So you just want to drain it probably about halfway down the radiator, just to make sure you don't have a mess up here. And then also you have two fuel lines for the fuel injection system. There's going to be pressure on this, so you don't want to just break these lines and just let it spray all over. So these have a Schrader valve. Right here you can release the pressure. I have a fuel pressure gauge I'm going to hook up to there, and I'll be able to drain out any fuel that comes out. So you want to disconnect your fuel lines. There's one here, already loosened. You want to be careful, there might be some pressure in the line. I think I showed you the Schrader valve. You can release the pressure here, or if you're careful, you got a rag, just put it over this line, just to make sure there's no fuel pressure in there. It's up to you. So this front one was 11/16, and the one on the back is 3/4. Come underneath, take these bolts out of the fin shroud on both sides. And take this fan shroud out. 10mm socket. So now with the fan shroud out, we can easily get to this drain for the radiator. And we're just going to drain it down till we know we're below the upper coolant hose. Take this upper radiator hose loose. See if we drain enough water. There we go. So use this to break that seal. Now we should be able to pull it off. Might not be a bad idea to go ahead and get new radiator hoses. And we did. We drained enough. And underneath that, we're going to disconnect this heater hose. Alright, so the way these heater hoses are coming off, I'm going to go ahead and, or coolant hose, radiator hose and heater hose. I'm just going to end up replacing them because I don't trust them. Especially this one, I've already broke through it, trying to get it loose. Good thing is, this upper radiator hose comes around here, it just comes to right there. All the way to the radiator back here. Should be pretty easy to find. O'Reilly's, any place like that. Then this one comes around, back behind the alternator, and in my particular model, ends right here, just a heater hose. Take that clamp off, be able to replace that hose. I'm gonna end up just taking those off at both ends and replacing those hoses. Alright, so to let you know some issues I'm having, some things to look out for. It's such an old vehicle, this kind of stuff happens. I ended up cutting this hose off, I can't get it off there. Gonna get a new heater hose for that. Told you about the upper radiator hose, which came around here, went down to there. It came off without issue. But when I went to take the upper, or when I went to take out the heater hose that was here, off of here, this is the valve that controls whether or not the coolant actually goes to your heater core and gives you heat inside the cab. There's your firewall. You got both heater lines right there. That's what these two are. Now this control valve right here When I took that off, you see that plastic piece broke right there. So as I go back taking more stuff off and apart, little brittle plastic things tend to break. So now I've got to get a new valve. This whole, actually the manifold I guess you'd call it, this whole heater manifold. The good thing is, if this happens to you, all you have to do is get 2 new heater hoses, and you can get a piece of pipe that's the size, that's the inside diameter of this heater hose here and the other one that I have to buy, and you could just do a continuous loop where coolant would still go through here, and it would act just like the car that does not have any heat. So if this happens to you, you can splice those two together, get on the road, car won't overheat. You just won't have heat inside the cab. So here's the coolant or the heater core manifold I was talking about. This is what broke on the bottom. This stuff gets hot inside the engine compartment. Stuff gets hot, brittle, especially with plastic, and it breaks. So I'm gonna have to get a new one of these. But I do want to show you something that'll definitely make your life easier when it comes to radiator hoses. Get a pair of these. One side of the jaws has a dish, the other side has a cutout, and it's made for these clamps. So you see the way these clamps are made, and if you ever tried to put these on and off or take them off and on with channel lock pliers, it can be done, but it's a pain in the butt. This tab side here, put the dish side of the pliers on there, just like that, and then the other side, will grip onto the other side of the clamp like that, and it has a ratcheting mechanism. Tighten it down and it holds it. No hands. Holds it in place. Allows you to be able to move the clamp up and down the hose just like that. Makes it a whole lot easier. Can't always get this in tight spaces in some cars, but it'll at least get the ones that are easier to get to. Make your life a whole lot easier. When you release it, grab this lever right here and it releases. Now you got a good idea, hopefully, of the lower intake manifold. I'm going to disconnect any wire connectors that you see all up and down. Try to get everything out of the way that we can, for when we unbolt this, we can get it up without an issue. These are all your fuel injector connectors. Pull the wiring harness loose from the valve cover. So after your wires are disconnected, you got more vacuum lines. Got one over here. We're going to disconnect it right here to get it out of the way. It goes to your fuel pressure regulator. Unplugs in the back. Should just pull out like that. Unplug this one here. It just unplugged. It might be a little stuck. I got both of those disconnected, and it goes all the way around the back of the engine. All the way back over here where we started. If you remember when we took these vacuum lines off, the left side of the intake, the upper intake, that's where those go. So now I believe we got enough things disconnected. We have enough movement in the wiring harness to take off this valve cover. So we'll take off both valve covers off of both sides to get this bottom intake manifold out. And you have your bolts. This is not going to be easy to film, so I'm just going to show you the bolts all the way down, around, and then back around the back side, all the way around the top up here. Another bolt there. And a bolt there, all the way around, both sides. So now before you start taking bolts and nuts out, you're gonna want to cover this intake. You don't want anything falling down into it. Some of y'all probably screaming that as soon as I took the intake manifold off. But if you were, there you go. Better. 10mm socket. Gonna want a deep well because in the back there's another one of those studs. So the reason we're taking the valve cover off is because the valve covers actually bolt to the intake manifold, the lower intake manifold, and the head down here. And then you have these lower intake manifold bolts. Take those out. So obviously when we go back together, we'll put the lower intake manifold in. We'll put the valve cover back on. And what you don't want to forget is when you go to put your new seal on, you want to RTV these seams right here. So you have a seam there where the lower intake manifold goes on top of the head. RTV that along with the new gasket. And the front is the same way. And right here you can see the RTV on the seam in between the lower intake manifold and the head. So the driver's side should be similar to the passenger side. 8 bolts. See if I can get to them with the deep well. So I struggle with the valve cover again. The reason why I was trying to be too nice. One problem I've got is I always try to take out as little as possible. Should probably do a little more work on this wiring harness and get it out of the way. But I just took out this big plug here. It plugs in right here. 10mm bolt comes out. Comes right off, no problem. Pry up on this. Tuck the wire harness back and lift up on the back and pull this thing out. Just like that. Whoa, what a pain. So one thing that would have really helped me on the driver's side is if I would have disconnected this line, this wire all the way at the end of the wiring harness on the driver's side. I could have picked it all the way up. Been a lot easier. Now where this was is it was snaked behind the compressor all the way down and connected right there. Looks like an oil sending unit. Looks like an oil sending unit for oil pressure, possibly. But it just had one keeper on it. It just pulls right off. Too easy. Push the wiring harness out of the way. You can get the driver's side valve cover out a lot easier. And on the passenger side, I could have helped myself out a lot by disconnecting the crank position sensor wire. That's this wire right here. It goes all the way down behind the alternator and then down below through here. And all the way under the vehicle to right there. So what you actually have is a metal wire clip in the bottom. Stick a screwdriver in there, pull that out, and then pull this connector back to the passenger side. Pull it out, then snake the wire out from the bottom. And just like that. And I would have had a lot more room to get that valve cover off. Now with both side wiring harnesses out of the way, you can get to the bolts for the lower intake manifold. Should be 8, 4 on each side. That's the passenger side. And then 4 on the driver's side. 10mm bolts. Now we've finally gotten down to the lower intake manifold gasket. Pull it loose. And there it is. That'll give you an idea of how in depth this job is. These are the top of your heads, driver's side, passenger side. Lower intake manifold goes on top of that. Straight onto the top of the engine, push rods, rocker arms, you name it. At this point, your engine should look something like this, and you're going to simply clean up the areas where the gasket was laying, lay your new gasket down on top of the heads, and torque them into sequence and specs laid out by the manufacturer. Here's a torque chart for you. You want to torque the bolts in 3 easy steps. As you can see, the bolt sequence 1, 2 are at opposite corners, 3 and 4 are at opposite corners. Then you go to the middle and torque 5, 6, 7, and 8. The first time you follow the sequence will be at 71 inch-pounds. Step 2, follow the same sequence at 107 inch-pounds. And then step 3, the same sequence, 143 inch-pounds. And to save any more time in your life from watching this very long video, I'm not going to show you the entire reassembly. Just realize that it's going to be opposite in the way we took it apart. Now with the lower intake manifold installed, torqued with new gaskets, we're going to work on the valve covers. Be sure to install your new left-hand valve cover gasket. Make sure to RTV the seams where the head meets the lower intake manifold. Put your valve cover on. Follow the sequence at 71 to 89 inch-pounds. And now for the right side, make sure to put on a new valve cover gasket. Make sure to use RTV at the seams between the lower intake manifold and the head. Put your valve cover on there. Follow the sequence, 72 to 89 inch-pounds. And after getting all that installed, wires back in place, everything that's aggravating, your engine should look something like this. Now before you put the upper intake manifold on, of course you want to make sure everything is buttoned up below it. The fuel line in the back needs to be tight. Make sure your wiring harness is all in place. Fuel injector is in place. Now I left this front fuel line loose so I can have it out of the way of the radiator hose and the upper intake manifold when I put it back. And again, make sure your rear fuel line is tight. And finally, once you clean the top of the fuel rail where your upper intake manifold mounts, you want to put your new seals in the upper intake manifold, set it down, and torque the nuts to 15 to 18 foot-pounds. Once you get the upper intake manifold torqued properly, it's now time to put everything back together. Hopefully you took a bunch of pictures so you can remember where everything goes. Maybe you're way better than I am and you know where everything goes. Attach everything back where it's supposed to be, crank it up, and this thing now runs like new with no vacuum leaks. Now with the Explorer running so good, I decided to let it idle and run, make sure I don't have any overheating issues while I clean the garage floor. Now if you watch this video in its entirety, I want to thank you. You're a trooper to watch a video so long. And if you're watching this video to do the job, it may seem a little intimidating, but I promise if you take your time, do it step by step, give yourself plenty of time to accomplish the job, you can get it done. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time.